So in the last video, we created our model and we linked that to our user, this application user object. We also enabled migrations for databases, and we actually created the database using a code first kind of approach. So what we're going to do now, and hopefully this will make things a bit clearer. I realized the last video probably felt a bit like jumping in the deep end, but it's one of these things, like I was saying, it's hard to teach to pick where to start with this framework. So we've got our model. That was the main thing, is we've defined this model and we've set up a seeding function here, so that when the entity framework creates a database, it seeds it with an example user. So what we're going to do now is create our first controller. So the way we do that is we just right click on controllers, and then we want add, and we click controller. And what we want to do, we have a bunch of choices here. We could just write an empty controller, which would give us literally what it sounds like. It would be completely empty, and we'd have to write everything ourselves. We could do a controller that has read-write actions, but no way of viewing them. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a controller with views using an entity framework data context. Now this data context is going to be our application DB context, which we have been using before, that we added the table of to-dos to. Okay, so I'm going to click add. Now the model that we're interested in editing is to-do. Okay, so to-do. And the data context we want is our application DB context. So we're editing the model to-do, which is this thing here, and we want it to point to this database, so DB context. And then I wanted to generate the views. Reference script libraries is going to be referencing things like jQuery, which we want that to do. Using a layout page, we're going to just use the default layout page. We'll probably talk about that a bit later in a future video. And the controller name, it's already made for us. So it's called it ToDo's controller. So it's pluralized the name of our class and added the word controller to it. So if I click add, it's going to start scaffolding. And what scaffolding is, it's creating all the controller and all the views to do what we just asked it to. So let's have a look at the controller first. So the controller, ToDo's controller, that's been created, has a number of, well, let's go through line by line. So it's a public class called ToDo's controller, and it extends the base class controller, which is something that is part of MVC. The first thing you see here is we've got an application DB context called DB, which is a new application DB context. Now that comes from here. So we defined application DB context, and we defined all these tables that go into that. So this is our data context, our data access layer here, which we're defining. And then we're going to be using this in the various methods to view things in the database and to add things to the database, to get things out, and to do queries. So we first got index, which returns a view of DB to-dos to list. So it's going to list all of the to-dos and return that as a view. We've got details. Well, in fact, actually, do you know what? I'm going to run this and show you it running to explain this to you a bit better. So what it's also created, I'm just going to show you, is it's created a folder of to-dos in views, and it's got a file for each one of these methods. So edit, there's like an edit one, create, there's a create one. So let's run this. So at the moment, this hasn't changed from what the default was earlier. But if I now do this, if I navigate to to-dos, because that's the name of our controller, then we get this. So in the way MVC works is that unlike some web frameworks where what you type here, so let's look at what the URL is. A URL is a host name and port followed by some kind of path. And usually you're probably used to this path pointing to a specific file. So maybe it's a different, I'm trying to think of an example. I don't think I can find an exact example. But you can imagine you've got a bunch of HTML files on your web server, and you'd expect maybe this is index, maybe it's gallery, maybe it's guestbook or something, and that's pointing to a specific file. Now, the framework that we're using doesn't do that. What it does is it looks at this path, and then a routing system looks at a route table and matches that path to something in the route table that corresponds to a call. It actually calls a function. It instantiates a controller and calls an action to that controller. So in this case, we've typed to-dos, it's created a to-do controller, and it's called the index method to that controller. And what that's done is it's returned a view, and it's given that an argument db.todos.tolist. Okay, so that's what's happened is we've gone to .todos, and it's instantiated a to-do controller, and it's called that method, that action method of that class. Now, if we wrote details, in fact, let's not do details because that's probably going to details isn't going to work because we haven't got anything in there. But if I do create, what we've got is this is now called the create method. We've got a form here, and we can write in, let's say, to do 1, and I can click create, and you can see we've gone back. That's redirected us back to this to-dos index, and now there's a list. And I've got to do 1 is done, and I can click on these links. I can get details, and that takes me, now the details is working. We've got to-dos /details/1. And what that's doing is it's calling this method with an argument of 1, because that's what, here you can see you've got the 1. And so that's what the scaffolding has done, is it's set up a system that allows this all to work. And let's have a quick look. So I'm going to stop this. And let's have a look at our create view. So what we've got in our create view is this is what we were seeing on the page before, is that we've got a HTML form. So this, I can't go into details of the Razor language or details of Razor in this tutorial video. I'm going to assume that you know a little bit. So this is, we've got at the top, we're importing the model that we're using is our to-do here. We're using a HTML helper, begin form, and then there's a form being made that's got things like labels for our model description. So it's the label for this and the editor for this. Okay, and then this is a form that will create a new to-do item. Okay, so at the moment I can create these. When I created this, it didn't automatically, so we can go to the create method and see what's going on. So what we've got here is our create method is taking a to-do as its argument, and it's adding, if the model is valid, it's adding that to-do to our DB context. So db.todos, to-dos is the table. So if we remember, in our identity model we define to-dos in our application DB context. So that's the table. And then we're using .add, which is a method that adds this to the database. Then save it. We're saving the changes, db.savechanges, and then redirecting to the index. Okay, and let's show you that again. Now, what's quite cool is if you have like a view selected and you click run, it will take you straight to that view. So I can create item 2. I click create, and it redirects me to the index. Okay, and I can see what's there. So I'm going to exit that, and then stop. So how is that working? So what's happening is that this form, so we've got a HTML helper there that's starting a form, and it's taking those inputs and putting it into a model, which is our model, which is defined here, the to-do list.models.todo, and then it's sending that as a post request to this controller, and this controller is taking that as an input and it's putting that into this add. And what's quite nice about this framework is that using something called model binding is we're not having to figure out ourselves how to take these form inputs and relate it back to this model, like to create a class and say, right, whatever was in this particular input box, that's the description. So to-do.description equals this string. It's doing that all for us using model binding. And so we can just take an input as this to-do type. And then it's saying, well, if that's valid, based on some validation tests, then we add it to our database. Now, what isn't happening is that there isn't any link being made between this to-do and the user that's creating it. Okay, because that is something, it's a bit more complex what's going on. It's not something that can just be automatically done by the scaffolding. So that's some logic that we need to add to this method. And the way to do that is we need to get a hold of the current user object. Who is the current user? What's their application user object? And then we can associate that, add that to this to-do object here, and then add to the database. So the way we do that is that there's some methods to help us. So we're going to do string current user ID equals, and then what we can do is we can type user dot identity dot get user ID, and we might need to get some. Yeah, we need to use Microsoft Identity for that to work. So again, we're using this namespace, Microsoft.asp.net.identity. And so user is the current user who is using your application. And then we're going into that user's identity and getting their user ID. And what that allows us to do is we can take that ID and look in our database that was defined here, our application DB context, and grab the user object and use that to put a reference here into our to-do that's being created. So we do that like this. Application user is the type of user that we're getting. So current user equals DB, remember, is our database that we define as a private field here. So DB dot users dot first. So users is a table that we first or default. I'm just gonna show you back here. So remember, this is a database, and the database includes a table of users. So we're going to do a query. We want the first or default user, so X, and you do this with lambda expressions. So this is what I was saying about having this data access layer where we're not actually writing SQL queries ourselves. This is actually, we're going to write a Lambda expression, and then the framework is going to write the query for us. So x.id. So we're looking for an object where the object.id is equal to the current user ID. So here x is our kind of general user, where the ID of the user in the database is equal to the current user ID. That's what we want. So we'll get, and we want the first. There should only be one. So we want the first user that has that ID. And then what we can do is we can say ToDo .user. Remember, this is the model that we've got from our view. So this is the argument we've got here. Equals current user. Okay, so now we've brought this model in. This model itself only had the description ID and is done. It only had these things set. And then what we've done is in our controller, we've put the logic to get the current user's identity. Using that user ID, find the user object from our user database, and then associated that user object with this ToDo item here. And then we put it into the database. And we return the view as normal. So let's see if this works. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run this again. Now to see if this is actually working, I'm going to have to log in. So if you remember, we seeded our database with a user that was user1@email.com with the password. So user1@email.com, and the password is password. And I'm going to log in. Okay, I'm going to click save just to make it easier for myself. So we logged in, so look, that totally worked. And then we want ToDo's create. And I'm going to put user1, let's first ToDo create, and that worked. Now what you'll notice here is we've gone back to the index and we've got user ones. I can see the one I've created. I can also see the ones that I didn't create, that were created by that when we weren't logged in, but we'll have a different user. We'll fix that in a moment, but I want to show you something. So when we're actually running our application, we can look in this Server Explorer and see the connections that we've got, and one of them is to our database. So I want to connect to this, just double clicking it. Let's have a look at tables. We've got our to-dos. So let's have a look at show table data. And that will load. And what we've got is, you can see these are all the things we've created. And the first two, their user ID is null, because with that we hadn't written that logic. We hadn't written this logic yet. So there was no way of it knowing what the user ID was going to be. So they're set to null. Now we've also got in this database all the other tables that are to do with the identity system. So we can show the data here, and what we've got is we can see our ID. So this is the information to do with the user. Now that's not where the okay, well, there we go. So we've there's various things here with the users. So this is where all our users will be saved. I don't think that the user ID here will match the user ID in here. I think, is it the security stamp? No. So there's kind of a behind the scenes thing going on that links these, and that's why we can't straight use the user ID here to do our database search. Or we can't use that. We can't just put current user ID in here, we need to go through and get the user object, I think. Anyway, okay, so at the moment, our functionality is that we can create to-do items. Well, we can add and remove items from a checklist, yeah? So I could have clicked delete and got rid of it, so I can tick this off. What we haven't got working yet is users should only see to-dos lists they have created. Because at the moment, I can see these others. I know that the user associated these are null, but still that they shouldn't appear. Like the user is null. Like I'm not null, right? I'm user 1. So that's going to be in our index function. So yeah, just to make sure you're following. So when we go to create, I don't want create, I want to-dos. So to-dos calls the function index. It's the default routing. So we haven't got anything. If I typed index, that would work as well. But we don't have to type index. It's like if you go to a normal website, that's like the default. You should know this. It always goes to index.html. In this case, our index then refers to this function. So what it's doing here is it's returning a view that's got a list of all the to-dos in the database. And that's why we're seeing all of them. So we need to actually tell this not to return all of them. So we need to do a query. The first thing is we need to get the user, so get the current user. So we're going to do it the same way we did before. So current user ID equals user.identity.get user ID. And we're going to do exactly the same. Application user, current user equals looking in the database DB users dot first or default, and we've got the lambda expression. So our general object x, we want x where x.id is equal to the current user ID. Current user ID. So this will get the current user. But so then we need to add a query to this. So we can do .where, same a lambda expression again. So x where x x dot. So this x here now is a to-do item. User equals current user. Okay, so now I'm going to load the index one. So we're going to look into this in a bit more detail in another video, but let's just leave that for now. So I'm going to click here, and that will launch to our whatever their build errors. Oh, my bad. So I forgot to close the bracket. So I'm going to launch that. So now, there we go. We're only seeing the to-do list that we created because we added this logic here that looked at who's the current user, and let's, instead of returning the whole list to our view, let's just return the to-dos where the user equals the current user. Okay, so what we can do is we can actually tick off users should only see to-do lists they've created. Something else we should add actually is users should only be able to edit their own to-do items. Okay. Again, sounds obvious, but we need to state that because at the moment that's not the case. Like I could edit other items, but we're going to look into that in a future video how to stop that. So what have we done? I know this has probably gone through quite quickly, but because it's a video, I hope you can rewind and try and follow it again at your own pace. So in the last video, we created our to-do model here, which was todo.cs, a to-do class. And that class has an ID, which is our primary key for that class in our database table. It has a description and it has an isDone boolean. We wanted to link those to-dos with our user. And using the ASP.NET identity system, our user is an object application user. So we've put a reference there to the user. Now, because we're using a code first convention, we needed to put a table of to-dos in our data context. And we were using the application DB context, which was the default context that was created to store the user information. So we added that using this DB set here. So this is our data access layer. It was adding a new table to this data context called to-dos. We enabled migration using the package manager console, and we seeded a new user in the configuration file that was created. We then added a controller, which was a to-dos controller. And that also, we told the framework to also scaffold some views. So it created create, delete, details, edit, index views for us. And all these views are associated with a method in this class. And whenever we navigate to these views, the .NET is instantiating a controller and it's calling one of these methods. The default scaffolding didn't associate these to-dos with a user. All it did was it filled in the description and isDone. The ID was automatic because it's the primary key, so it was just increasing that. But it wasn't doing anything with the user. So we had to write logic in our controller to get the current user, get the current user's ID, use that ID to do a query in our database of users, which we defined in our controller here as our application DB context. That then gave us our current user, and then we could put that current user, set it to the user in this object, which came from our view, and then added that to the database. So this associated each to-do that was created with the user that created it. And that was kind of step one. Step two is that we only wanted users to be able to see the ones they created themselves. So we needed to add some more logic to the index method, where same kind of thing, we're getting the current user using the identity system, doing a database query using this lambda expression to find the user object for the current user, and then instead of returning the whole list of to-dos to the view, we only returned the to-dos where the user is equal to the current user. And that gave us, we've now got basic functionality. We can create to-dos, and every time it's created, there's a link to the current user that's put in. And then we can, when we view to-dos, we don't see all of them. We only see the ones associated with whoever is logged in. And so hopefully in those two videos, go through them again. If you're not quite following, watch them again. I know it's about an hour in total, but this is kind of, this stuff is I would say like the basics. There's some slightly more advanced stuff with this user relationship, which isn't done automatically for you, which you need to do yourself. So that's quite important to look at, and hopefully is quite useful. So it's the first time I've done any kind of programming live on a video like this. So I'd love to get some feedback of how I'm doing this. I hope it's okay for you to follow. What would probably be useful is if you tried to write this code as I'm doing it, like pause the video and do it. If you have any questions, then ask me. Any feedback, like I said, I'd like to hear that. So I'm going to leave it here for now in this video. And then the next one, what we're going to start to do is, if we look at our aims, we said we wanted to So, information stored server side, we've done that, haven't we? So style should change. We're not going to do that right now. I'm going to order these a bit based on priority. And right, we've done these. We've done that. We've done that. Users should only be able to edit their own items. The page shouldn't refresh when a user adds a new item. So at the moment, adding a new item is a bit of a palaver. So, right, let's go ToDo. ToDo. So if I want to create new, I'm at my list of to-dos. I've got to click create new. That takes me to another page, let alone just refreshing the page I'm on. I now add my other to-do, another to-do. And look, I've had to move various pages to get this done. It's not very, doesn't feel good from a user point of view, right? Whereas these to-dos, like it's really, this is kind of cool and really good. Another to-do, right? That's so easy and that's really good. And if we can create that functionality, I want a text box here basically that as I type in and push enter, immediately I get the feedback of I've added a new view. I've added a new to-do. I don't want this click and create new to go to another thing and that kind of stuff. So yeah, and the other thing is to like this. These aren't actually checkboxes. These are just showing if that's done. If I want to check this is done, I've got to click edit. I've got to click here. Then I've got to click save. Like that isn't a to-do. An effective to-do list is about getting that endorphin hit of like crossing something off your list. Is a really important part of a to-do list. The other thing is that this is just like default stuff at the top. If I go to the home page, there's no way of me getting to that page without like writing in something myself. I know we didn't add that to our list of to-dos, but that is an important thing. So we're going to see how we can add that. That's probably what we'll start the next video doing. So again, I want feedback would be great. So I will do the next video probably this afternoon and post it up. So thanks for watching. I hope this is useful. Like I said, this is the first time I've done anything like this. So, take it, realize that when you're watching and let me know how I can improve it. Thank you.